Hello, Econ 311 students. This lesson we're going to again move forward into some more advanced topics in economics using the concepts that we've already looked at and talked about quite a lot. This lesson is about the market, how the market system works, how prices are determined, and the concept of relative scarcity. So we're going to start with Adam Smith, who is really called the father of modern economics by many people. He was an Enlightenment philosopher. He was Scottish, and you can see from the time frame that he lived that he would have been a contemporary of the founding fathers and the other Enlightenment philosophers that were instrumental in forming our nation of the United States. So Adam Smith influenced the people that created our nation in a lot of ways because he was a contemporary of theirs, and he had a lot to say about what he observed in the market system. As a social scientist, he was an observer. He didn't invent anything. He simply reported what he saw in market behavior, and what he came to understand were a few basic concepts that he really encapsulated in his book that we call The Wealth of Nations. Pretty famous book, printed in 1776. And it's actually short for an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. But in the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith observes that in market transactions, profit is the motivator and competition is the regulator. And so it basically tells us that what gets us into market transactions is the incentive or the motivation to earn profit, and that what regulates our market activity is the competition in markets. So to look at that a little closer, as he's talking about profit motivating individuals in markets, he says it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our necessities, but of their advantages. What he's talking about here is this idea that all economic beings are self-interested, not necessarily selfish. Sometimes it's interpreted that way, but he's not talking about selfishness, which would exclude consideration of all other people. He's referring to the idea that we are all motivated to make ourselves better off. And this takes lots of different forms, but particularly he's speaking of the market and the participants in a market. So he's saying that we don't go to somebody that we want to purchase from and beg from them and appeal to their good soul, although they may have good souls or not. But what we address ourselves to is what we can do to benefit them during this transaction. So we address ourselves not to their goodwill, but to their self-interest and their willingness to make themselves better off. This goes back to our principle of exchange. The principle of exchange tells us that when two people make an exchange, both anticipate to be better off from the exchange, a voluntary exchange. So Adam Smith was a keen observer of human behavior, and he saw this very clearly. He also said that competition serves to regulate market behavior. And so he's talking about competition among producers. And he said specifically if he charges too much, speaking of a producer of a product, for his wares, or if he refuses to pay as much as everybody else for his workers, he'll find himself without buyers in the one case and without workers in the other. So he's talking about firms being competitors, both for their workers, in which case they have to pay a competitive wage in order to entice workers to work for them. And they also have to be competitors as sellers. They have to make sure that their prices are in line with those of other sellers so that they can attract buyers to their business. So this is a really powerful statement about how markets operate. Markets, by definition, are simply the exchange, the voluntary exchange of goods and services. That is all it is. And so Adam Smith didn't discover capitalism, but he did define it for the first time. And he referred to the term capitalism to describe this free and voluntary exchange between two willing participants, and both of those participants are expecting to be better off when the exchange is made. He goes on in his book, The Wealth of Nations, to describe a concept called the invisible hand. The invisible hand is what he describes as a mechanism that moves people within markets. And he says it happens as if by an invisible hand. He doesn't suggest that there is something, but he said the actions of individuals within the market are such that it seems like they must be guided by some invisible force that we can't see. And this invisible hand really is self-interest in the participants and competition working together. So he's saying that these two forces govern the market and keep people from being dishonest with their sales and being interested in themselves when it comes to their purchases and appealing to the self-interest of sellers when they're making purchases. So what happens when we have a market that is governed by the invisible hand is that efficient producers and buyers are both made better off. They're rewarded. It results in producing the amount of goods that society wants, and no more and no less, because the wants of society will guide the actions of producers. The quantity society wants will be produced. There won't be shortages or surplus. That's really our definition of an efficient market. And it will do so at prices that society is willing and able to pay. It leaves us with this thing called normal profits. Now, this is kind of an advanced economics topic, but normal profits simply means zero economic profit, or break-even profits might be an easier way to understand it. Break-even profits don't necessarily mean that on paper everybody breaks even, but the concept of a normal profit is one that says that a firm is not earning so much profit that it entices other firms to enter the market, and they're not losing so much that they are enticing firms to leave the market. So normal profits are what we would call equilibrium or zero economic profits. It's not a bad thing. On paper, it means a positive economic profit. That's a different topic. But just understand that normal profits are those profits that don't change the behavior of other firms, either to enter the market or to leave the market. So we're going to talk about price and relative scarcity. Where do they come from and how are they related? So here is our list of objectives. We're going to talk about the characteristics of an efficient market. We're going to distinguish between absolute and relative prices. We're going to understand how price determination is related to the competition between buyers and sellers. We're going to define relative scarcity, and we're going to talk about the relationship between relative price, and relative scarcity. So let's start by defining an efficient market. And this acronym of CRIIP helps to just remember the components of an efficient market. So an efficient market, one which allocates goods and services in a way that make both buyers and sellers better off at prices that society wants to pay and in quantities that society wants to pay, are made up of these components. They must have, or characteristics. They must have competition. There must be many firms, or at least several firms, that are producing a similar or even identical product. That competition keeps a firm honest. If you think about this, what keeps a firm from charging a super high price and producing poor quality goods? Often it's because they are looking over their shoulder at their competitor who is pricing in similar ways and always seeking to improve their product. So many products you can think of are at reasonable prices, or at least at prices that are set by the market, and are good quality because firms have competition. So that helps with keeping the market efficient, producing what society wants in the quantities they want at the prices they're willing to pay. The rule of law definitely has to exist. The rule of law guarantees the ability to own property and to govern the market should somebody break the rules. Because markets aren't full of perfect people. Markets, of course, have individuals that may vary or stray from the rules, in which case the rule of law is there to make sure that there is a system for punishing those variations and for encouraging people to remain within a set of rules that governs markets. Information is definitely essential in an efficient market, both for buyers and sellers. Information about prices, information about quantity, information about substitutes, all of that. If you think of yourself going into a market to purchase something, you are much more efficient in your use of your funds when you have information about what else is available, what value you're getting for your money. The more information, the more informed a decision, as we saw in previous lessons, the more effective and efficient a decision can be. So information definitely matters. Incentives have to exist. Both buyer and seller have to feel that there is a reason to enter into an agreement or voluntary exchange. And those incentives can be lots of different things, but there has to be an expectation that both parties will gain. This is our principle of exchange. Again, and property rights really fit in with the rule of law, but they're a very important component of this because property rights allow individuals to own and establish ownership and protect ownership of what they're exchanging. So property rights are established by law and enforced through a legal system. So a broad and well-established system of property rights that is enforced by a legal system is essential to any market economy. And any market has to have the ability to enforce property rights. If I can't own something, and if I don't have the right legally to exchange it, to dispose of it, to do what I want with it, then a market can't work. So it's very important. And as you look through international trade, and this will be a study outside of this class, but it's an interesting thing to look at how property rights align with economies that grow. Where there are few or no property rights, those economies don't grow because people don't have an incentive to improve their property. If I can't own it, why would I improve it in any way? So property rights matter a lot in the market system and in any system where people want to see economic growth happen. So let's talk about relative versus absolute price. This is something you're going to come to a lot, and it's a really important concept to understand. So absolute price is something that a lot of people like to use. So here's the first statement. In my day, a loaf of bread cost 5 cents. I'm sure you've heard that before. I'm sure you've heard people describe other things that didn't used to cost as much, and it sounds as if the price today is so outrageous in comparison. That would be what we call an absolute price. If we look at it in different terms, if we look at it in the context of where that price came from, we then can start to see the relative price and how it's more meaningful in a relative context. So the response to that would be, well, yes, but let's look at some other conditions at that time. So the price in absolute terms, 5 cents compared to $2, sounds ridiculous, right? You would say the price today by those comparisons is outrageous. However, if you start to look at the relative information, so for example, earnings, if you earned $1.25 a day and a house costs $7,500, then that cost of 5 cents has a very different context. And this is important because we want to be good decision makers. We want our students to understand good decision making. And as we've said before, more information helps us make better decisions. So if we're talking about evaluating the cost of something in 2 time periods, the relative information really has an important role here. The price of a good or service is only relevant in terms of its comparison to income and all other goods and services. So that loaf of bread that cost 5 cents suddenly has a very different meaning when we understand what our earnings would have been at that point, or somebody's earnings, and what a house would have cost. And we could have compared it to other goods and services as well, but these are pretty good ones to work with. So you might ask yourself, then, if we go back to the idea of an absolute price, is $10 a high price for a movie ticket? Well, if you took that today, you might say, not so bad. The average movie ticket is about $12, $12.50. And so you'd say $10 in 2020 is probably not a high price for a movie ticket. However, if I asked this in 1950, that would be a completely different answer. So you'll notice that $10, that absolute number, isn't meaningful until I relate it to other things. So the absolute price is meaningless. It only gives information when we relate it to the other factors like income and prices of other goods and services. A really important concept. I don't want you to get into fights with older people because they like to say these things, but keep that in mind. So the next time someone says, a house is crazy expensive these days, and I only paid $20,000 for my first home, just be kind to them and remember that that is relative to different earnings and the cost of other goods and services being different. So let's look at relative prices. If income is $30,000, and here's our Harry Potter book, $10, and a CD is $20, which you're probably laughing because we don't really buy CDs anymore and certainly don't pay that much. And here is a very, very ugly sweater for $40. Well, these prices make sense given the income. However, what if our income doubles and the prices of these same goods doubles as well? What's happened here is absolute prices have doubled. And we might complain and say, gosh, now it's twice as much. That sounds terrible. But if we understand that relative prices haven't changed because the prices of other goods have doubled and our income has doubled. So in this situation, you can see relative prices haven't changed. And this is, again, a really great way to understand prices. Absolute prices are just numbers. They don't mean anything until you put them in the context of other things. The same is true of lots of numbers you're going to encounter in your economic lives. You might see the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It's just a number until you compare it to that same value at different times. So keep that in mind when we're talking about prices. Relative prices matter, absolute prices do not. So then, now we want to know what determines relative prices. Where do prices come from? This is such an important concept to understand. We really want our students to learn this. And this is a lesson that can be produced in different ways, presented to our students in different ways. You can do buying and selling activities. You can engage in different trade activities that help them to see this. But this, for our course, is really an important thing for you to have as an understanding so that you can then make sure you pass this along to your students. So there are two things that determine prices. And this is probably something you've seen before, you've studied at one point or another, but there really are just two influences, and those are, what you can imagine, demand and supply. So the first set of things that influences prices are the buyer decisions. That's the demand side of the market. And that is influenced and changed by different things that we call shifters of demand or determinants of demand. But really, things can change the level of demand. So how many buyers are there? That will change the demand and, as a result, change the price. What do these buyers like? What are their tastes and preferences when it comes to their buying behavior? Can that change? Certainly, all advertising is geared towards changing tastes and preferences and increasing buyers' demand. How rich or poor are they? How much money do they have? That definitely affects the decisions of buyers on the demand side. What alternatives exist to a given product? And what expectations do buyers have for the future? So all of these would be determinants of demand. But demand is half of the determination of relative prices. The other side of that, of course, is supply. And supply can be influenced and changed through determinants of supply. How many sellers are there? That's going to make a difference as to how much is going to be exchanged in the market. What does it cost to produce? It certainly matters. How much am I going to buy as a buyer is influenced by what the availability is from the seller side. How is the weather, which might sound silly, but suppliers are definitely influenced by natural phenomenon, by weather, by changes, natural diseases and things like that happen to their product or their crop. Government policies can influence the supply side of the market. Government policies, specifically taxes and excise taxes on producers and subsidies to producers, that can definitely influence the supply of an individual producer. And finally, what alternatives to production exist. So these would be our determinants for supply, but just like demand, supply is the other half of how prices are determined. And notice that I've given you determinants that show that these things change. There's not just one picture of demand and one picture of supply. Clearly, both of them can change, and they change often for some products. I'm sure you're aware of gasoline prices changing quickly and often, and clearly something is going on in that market to change that relative price to different things on the regular, and it has to do with these determinants of demand and supply. We'll talk about that in the next lesson. So the process then of price determination can be done with your students through a simple demonstration, and I really recommend this. In class, if we were in the classroom, I would have two students come to the front of the room, and I would show one student and make that student the buyer, and I would show that student the maximum that they're willing to pay. I would kind of relate that to their budget. I would make the other student the seller, and we could make up a product that's being sold between them. I usually just use my cell phone or something silly. And I explained to the seller that they have a minimum price that they're willing to accept. So we set some parameters and some incentives for the exchange to take place. And then I let them determine for themselves how that exchange is going to take place. The buyer has a maximum price, they have a budget. The seller has a minimum price, which we could call their production costs. And if they negotiate, almost always, students, first of all, will have a tough time getting started with it. They tend to be a little shy, but some students are born negotiators. You might be really surprised at how well this works with students. A very simple exercise, and it's actually something that they're pretty familiar with. Students have been exchanging for benefit for their whole lives, so they know all about this. And the exchange will take place at some price between the maximum and the minimum. And when they make a deal, they shake hands, they exchange the product, and they walk away. Now get your phone back if you do it with a phone. But here's the question to follow up that very simple exercise. Was CRIIP, all of the elements of an efficient market, was it present? So you ask yourself, did we have competition? Because could my buyer have gone somewhere else to purchase the phone? And you could say, if so, who is competing against whom? Now, in this particular case, you only have the two parties, so it wouldn't be really effective to talk about competition. If you did an exercise that was trading with multiple parties, you could talk about the competition among buyers and the competition among sellers. The rule of law, was the rule of law present in this exchange? Clearly there is, because for one of the students to just grab it and run would not be acceptable, and there would be recourse, legal recourse. So there are rules that govern that transaction. Was there information? What happened to the quantity of information? Now this says in the second round, this is assuming a different exercise, one that is multiple rounds with multiple buyers and sellers. And you could certainly do this exercise. In fact, I will make sure I post a copy of it in the Blackboard environment so that you can see if you want to try something that expansive with your students. It's a lot of fun, but it really requires that you narrow it down to what you're trying to accomplish, which is an understanding of these elements present in the marketplace. So was information there? And does information grow and improve as you continue trading? If you think about yourself and the things you buy, certainly you've purchased some things with little information, but given more time or more exposure to that sort of transaction, you would have more information. Were there incentives? Were both parties incentivized? Were they better off? And were property rights in place? So it's a great opportunity to do a hands-on demonstration. You could do consecutive ones and let different students try it, see if they come to different prices, see if they learn from watching a previous transaction. There are lots of ways you can make this appropriate to your students. It does not have to be an 8th grade lesson. This could be a 1st or 2nd grade lesson that simply shows them the process of trade, the principle of exchange, and demonstrates where that price came from. Because the key here is, where did that price come from? And what you see right away is it came from the interaction of the buyer and the seller. A price only exists when there is a voluntary agreement between buyer and seller to make the exchange. And that voluntary agreement is based on the idea that both parties expect to be better off. So some other questions you can ask if you are doing this exercise is, you can ask the class to evaluate, did the buyer gain from this exchange? Did the seller gain? And did they both create wealth by engaging in this exchange? So are both parties better off? It's a great exercise. It's a great way to visually see where prices come from. It's really easy for a lot of adults have kind of a blind spot when it comes to understanding prices, because it's really easy to lapse into the, well, prices are what the other guy says I must pay. But a real understanding of where prices come from helps to empower the buyer to understand that their participation in it is part of it. It's really easy to say gas costs too much and they're ripping me off and this is terrible. But if you stop to look at the exchange and realize, well, I choose to pay the $3 or whatever the price of gas happens to be. Since I choose that, I'm engaging in voluntary exchange. And I do have the ability to say, no, I don't like the consequences that come with that. And so I'm not going to do that. But I do have the ability to choose. Doesn't mean you can't complain about the price of gas, but it helps to understand where that price comes from, that it's not some wicked third party who is picking on you, that it is simply the exchange. It's supply and demand interacting to create an agreed upon price. So here's what happens when buyers and sellers are negotiating prices. Buyers always go into a negotiation or an exchange wanting the lowest possible price. So here's an example of people who they would really like to buy a house. They want to pay the lowest possible price, but what is going to be the challenge to that nice low price? I'm sure you're way ahead of me on this. They have competition. Other buyers may want that house. And if that's the case, then the price will necessarily rise. So competition helps to govern the price of that house. It doesn't sell for too little, and it also doesn't sell for too much. So the buyers, their behavior is regulated by the competition they experience from other buyers. And when buyers compete with buyers, prices rise. That's a really important thing to know. Sellers, on the other hand, want to charge the highest price possible. So here's that same house example. And the seller would love to charge as much as they can get for it, but what do they have to consider? They also have competition. Their competition will be other sellers. And we've seen this in the economy recently, where lots of people put their houses on the market and the value drops. Nothing inherently changes in the homes themselves, but what happens is when other sellers are competing against them, then the value of the home falls because people have different alternatives available to them. So their competition keeps prices low. So this goes back to what Adam Smith said about how competition regulates the market. Why don't houses get thrown out there on the market for $1 million? Because there's competition that governs and regulates that behavior. So prices don't tend to go way too high or way too low. Competition gives us what we call equilibrium price. So equilibrium is what it sounds like. It's a balance. It's that balancing point where demand is equal to supply, and it's kind of what I call the baby bear of economics. It's just right. There's not too much because the price is too high. There's not too little because the price is too low. It is the equilibrium point at which buyers and sellers meet in the middle. And if you're not convinced that equilibrium price is a familiar concept, think about something familiar. Think about a Snickers bar. This is a little bit silly, but if you think about a Snickers bar and I asked you, what does a Snickers bar cost? You'd probably say about $1. Now, not every Snickers bar sells for exactly $1. They can be more, they can be less. But $1 is an equilibrium. It's that economic equilibrium where most sellers are willing to sell for about $1. Most buyers are willing to buy for about $1. If the price went above that, you'd have fewer buyers, and they'd say, no thank you, I don't want to pay that much. And if the price went below that, you'd have fewer sellers because they'd say, hey, that cuts into my profits. And so that equilibrium happens when the price makes both parties satisfied. So how are prices determined then? Buyers compete against each other and they drive the price up. Important to know. If you're looking for an example of this, think of Storage Wars, the TV show where there's a storage locker or unit and multiple people bidding for it. And they're bidding against each other. There are buyers competing. And it drives the price up. The seller is not part of that. The seller isn't asking more for it. The buyers, rather, are the bidders that push the price up. The other part of this is sellers, when they compete, drive the price down. So think of different stores that sell the same thing. So retail stores, for example. When they have competition and they have too much of something, they will put it on sale. Not out of the goodness of their heart, but because they have competitors that are going to have similar prices, and so their area of competition is within the realm of price. And equilibrium then is determined by these very impersonal forces of supply and demand. And this word impersonal is so important because quite often we tend to think of price as personal. We tend to get upset about prices. We tend to say, I'm being ripped off. Someone's taking advantage of me. This is terrible. I'm such a victim. But really, prices are very impersonal. And when you learn to see them that way, when our students learn to see them that way, they're a lot more powerful in their decision making because they recognize that prices are the result of choices. And we want them to be really good decision makers. It matters. Equilibrium then is the concept that at a particular price, the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. And we're not going to have a surplus, which is too much, leftover product, or a shortage, which is too little. The market clears. So we call this a market clearing price. And all it means is, like I said, it's the baby bear of economics. This market clearing price is where you're not going to have an excess supply and you're not going to have a shortage. Think of a Snickers bar on sale in store for $1. There's not going to be a run on Snickers bars, neither are there going to be a ton left over on the shelf because people aren't willing to pay that price. At this equilibrium price, buyers who are able and willing to pay the price get the goods and services they want. Sellers who are willing and able to produce at that price sell all that they want. And we don't have too much or too little. An important part of this isn't to suggest that everybody is super satisfied with that. Not all prospective buyers or sellers are satisfied. Only the ones that are willing and able to produce and to buy at that market price, at that equilibrium price. So you might have some prospective buyers that they're just not willing to pay that much. You might have somebody who really doesn't like Snickers bars and they say, gosh, if I was going to have a Snickers bar, I would only pay $0.25 for it because they're kind of awful. They would not be satisfied with the market price of $1. However, it's important to remember that that market price satisfies those sellers who are willing and able to produce and those buyers that are willing and able to pay that particular price. So let's talk about relative scarcity. How does this factor into it? The relationship of supply and demand for one product compared to the relationship of supply and demand for all other products is how we define relative scarcity. So let me ask you some questions. What do these things have in common? If I asked you, how tall are you? How much do you weigh? How far did you drive to school? What was the price of your bottle of water? Well, first of all, you might say that's none of your business. But you'll notice there's something unique about the answers to these. They can all be measured and answered in objective units of measure. So how tall are you can be measured in feet and inches, right? How much do you weigh can be measured in pounds or kilograms. How far did you drive to school can be measured in miles. And the price of your bottle of water can be measured in dollars. So these are all similar in that there is an objective, measurable response. None of these are emotional. If I said, how tall are you? And you said, I'm 5'3", I wouldn't get worked up about that. There's nobody that would say, that is too tall. That's too short. That's shocking. That's outrageous. You can't be 5'3". That's not acceptable, right? There's no emotion attached to it. And we wouldn't attach any value judgments to weight or distance driven. However, we tend to get a little personal and take it a little personally when we look at the price of a bottle of water. So let's talk about prices. Relative price is the unit by which we measure relative scarcity. And let me just tell you, you're going to want to know this. So this nifty device here that you see on the screen is a scarcometer. And think about it. A thermometer measures the temperature in degrees Fahrenheit or Celsius. A scarcometer measures scarcity in terms of dollars, the price of something in dollars. So that's all it is. A price is a measurement of scarcity, relative scarcity, meaning supply and demand, the relationship of supply and demand to each other for a particular product. So let's do this. Rank some things in order of relative scarcity. So you can't see these items, but imagine I had some Sour Patch candy. I have an Uncle Sam bobblehead doll. It's pretty great. And a hamburger. Which of these things would you think is the most scarce of these three items? And I think you'd agree with me that Uncle Sam is the most scarce. And how I can tell is that the Uncle Sam doll has the highest price. Notice how I can measure scarcity in terms of price. It's very easy. Which one has more people that want it relative to the amount of it available? Well, that can be measured by price. So my Uncle Sam doll or bobblehead is the most scarce. And next would be a hamburger, depending on where you get it, but typically hamburgers are a couple of dollars. And so this would be first, this would be second, and our Sour Patch candy would come in third. So scarcity can be measured by price. So when I see gasoline at $2 in one place and $3 at another place, what I have to ask myself is, what's the difference? Why is one relatively more scarce than the other? And that can be explained through the impersonal forces of demand and supply. Keep that in mind. So we can order these products in terms of relative scarcity. And this is just another exercise. Remember that we can measure scarcity by looking at the price. Price is a measurement. It is not personal. It is not outrageous. It is not shocking. It is simply an objective measure of the scarcity of something. So clearly from our list here, the most scarce is the yacht. And the price of a yacht, I really don't know, but I understand it's in the millions. And clearly it is the most scarce item on the list. The price does not reflect anything outrageous or immoral or good or bad. It simply reflects the scarcity, the relative scarcity of a yacht relative to any of these other things. A yacht is much more expensive than a candy bar and much more scarce, meaning that There are many people that want it relative to the number of people that can or will obtain it. So yachts are more scarce than candy bars, and if we put these in order, let's see, I'm going to put them from most scarce to least scarce. How's that? So there's 1, and let's go with 2. I think a laptop, 3. I'm going to guess that a baseball game is more. Depends on where we're talking about, but professional baseball games can be pretty spendy. Depends on which teams you follow. Obviously, it's the Angels, for those of us that understand baseball. A nice dinner for 2 in LA would probably be next. And let's see, let's get that. Finally, dinner for 1 at McDonald's, probably next. And then our least scarce item would be our candy bar. So again, we're just ranking them by scarcity, which is measured by price. So there's the outcome there. Price then is, here's our definition of price. And it's so important for our students to really have an understanding of what prices are and where they come from. So price is the indicator or the measure of relative scarcity. It is determined by the interaction of supply and demand, totally impersonal forces. I promise there is nobody sitting in a room thinking of ways to rip you off. It is purely the interaction of demand and supply that creates these things. If a product becomes relatively more scarce, the price will rise. Right? So if more people want it relative to the amount of it available, then the price will rise. If the product becomes relatively less scarce, fewer people want it relative to the amount available, then the price will fall. So prices change when things become either more or less scarce. Let's talk about relative scarcity. Scarce is not the same as rare. Sometimes we confuse those two terms. Scarcity has to do with what people want. Rare, not necessarily. So you can have something that is rare but not scarce. Think of diseases or tarantulas come to mind. There are rare, thankfully, but there are not a lot of people. Now, if you're one of the people that thinks tarantulas are awesome, I'm happy for you. But I don't think there's a lot of folks out there that think that they are scarce, that they want them relative to what's available. So it's a very important distinction here between rare and scarce. Scarce has to be something people want. Relative scarcity then is determined by the interaction of supply and demand. How much is there, supply, relative to how much people want it, demand. Price is a unit of measure. And here is something to keep in mind. It is not moral or immoral. It is not ridiculous. And it certainly is not fair. So there's that 4-letter F word. We want to try to avoid that when we talk about prices. Because I know that there are times where you're going to encounter this, fair prices, fair wages. This word fair gets thrown out there. But when we're talking about the price of something, it can be labor, it can be lots of things. But price is not fair. Price is the impersonal interaction of supply and demand in a particular market. The message here is pretty basic. Relative prices are meaningful, not absolute prices. Those are just numbers without context. They don't mean anything. Prices are developed by two groups, buyers and sellers. Competition among buyers and competition among sellers determine the relative price of a product. And as we saw in our determinants, those can change. The relative price changes as demand and supply are changed by those determinants. Throughout history, prices have changed, and we know this. And we see this happening all around us. In your own life, I'm sure you've seen prices change for lots and lots of things, and they change as demand and supply change. Relative scarcity, then, is the relationship of supply and demand for one product relative to the relationship of supply and demand for all other products and income. So remember, there's that context. What are the prices of other products and income relative to the price. So watch out for this one because it says the same thing, but remember, relative scarcity is about how much there is versus how much people want it. That's the idea of the relationship between supply and demand. Okay, so that's our message, and we will go forward and look at more things related to price and changing prices, but a good foundation in understanding what prices are and where they come from is going to help us as we go forward.